Remind my colleagues that there's about 190 other countries on this globe that we can seek agreements with, and taking time to seek those agreements would be good. Along this line, Senator Boozman, chairman of the Ag Committee, and I, a member of the Finance Committee, which has jurisdiction over trade, sent letters to members of the Finance Committee, Agriculture Committee, and Ways and Means Committee of the House of Representatives. We ask our colleagues to listen to somebody that's had some experience dealing with some of these smaller nations with bilateral trade agreements. That person is a person by the name of Al Johnson. During the George W. Bush presidency, he negotiated trade agreements with about a dozen countries. It added up to about 6 or 7 different agreements, all bilateral, which I think is the way that President Trump prefers bilateral negotiations rather than multilateral negotiations. He was very successful, and that success can be measured by the fact that he has shown on his studies that with these dozen countries that were negotiated bilateral free trade agreements during the George W. Bush administration, that we have increased our trade with those nations by about 600%. So I hope my colleagues will give Al Johnson a chance to talk to them. I know he's already visited with some members of this United States Senate, and he's very vigorously promoting the idea that we ought to have bilateral negotiations, and with a lot of countries that we never think about that could be beneficial to American exports. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President.
I recognize the Majority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I ask that the unanimous consent the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, yesterday evening we invoked cloture on the nomination of Jameson Greer to be U.S. Trade Representative. Mr. Greer is admirably qualified for this position. He spent most of his career specializing in trade law and has extensive international experience. He served as a missionary in Brussels, received a master's degree from 2 Paris institutions, served as a law clerk for the European Court of Justice, and was stationed in both Turkey and Iraq as a member of the Air Force. Most significantly of all, he spent 3 years of the previous Trump administration serving as Chief of Staff to then U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer, who spoke highly of Mr. Greer's work. He is, in short, very well prepared for this role. Mr. President, one of my top priorities when it comes to trade is expanding opportunities for our nation's agricultural producers, like the many farmers and ranchers in my state of South Dakota. The Biden administration frequently seemed to have no interest in trade beyond negotiating on climate and labor issues. Witness the fact, Mr. President, that there was not a single FTA negotiated during the Biden administration. Not a single one. All the opportunities across the globe to enter into trade agreements, to open up and provide access to America's farmers and ranchers and small business people. Well, that was a real disservice, Mr. President, to America's ag producers and to our small businesses. Trade is critical to the continued success of American agriculture. 20% of U.S. ag products are exported yearly, and exports provide substantial farm income. Soybeans and corn alone accounted for 22% of all U.S. exports by value in 2024. But thanks in part to the Biden administration's almost complete inaction on trade, the current agricultural trade deficit is at an all-time high. And Mr. President, that's an area of our economy where we've always run trade surpluses, historically. Consistently over time, decade after decade, we've always run trade surpluses in agriculture until the last few years under the Biden administration, where we started racking up not only deficits, but now record trade deficits. They're at an all-time high. And I have to say that's a real problem for ag producers, especially considering the other challenges they've been facing. And it's something that needs to be addressed. And I know that the Trump administration is committed to meeting the needs of farmers and ranchers, and I'm looking forward to working with Mr. Greer to expand opportunities for our agricultural producers. I'm very encouraged by the fact that Mr. Greer has expressed his commitment to working closely with the Senate Finance Committee, of which I am a member, and with Congress. President Biden's trade representative was completely uninterested in working with Congress, so it is very encouraging to hear Mr. Greer's commitment to communication and collaboration. And I look forward to a close partnership between the administration and Congress in the coming months and years as we work to expand opportunities for American producers. Mr. President, this afternoon we're going to vote on a resolution to end the energy emergency that President Trump declared upon taking office. Apparently, according to the resolution's authors, this energy emergency declaration isn't justified. And Mr. President, in response to that, I'd like to just read a headline from the Washington Post last March. And that headline is, and I quote, "Amid explosive demand, America is running out of power," end quote. Now let me just repeat that, Mr. President, for my Democrat colleagues. Amid explosive demand, America is running out of power. Running out of power. The article stated, and I quote again, "Vast swaths of the United States are at risk of running short of power as electricity-hungry data centers and clean technology factories proliferate around the country, leaving utilities and regulators grasping for credible plans to expand the nation's creaking power grid," end quote. And then, of course, there was this headline from another major news outlet in December, and I quote again, "More than half the U.S. faces blackout risks in next decade," the NERC finds, end quote. Again, more than half the U.S. faces blackout risks in next decade. Large swaths of the U.S., the article noted, could experience rolling blackouts due to capacity shortfalls during extreme weather events in the next decade, according to a grid reliability analysis released Tuesday. The Mid-Continent Independent System Operator faces the highest risk of energy shortfalls starting as soon as this summer, according to the report from the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, which can force grid operators to trigger rolling outages to prevent wider system harm, end quote. Mr. President, these aren't niche publications. These are mainstream media outlets. Mainstream media outlets reporting on the fact that, and I quote again, America is running out of power. If my Democrat colleagues don't consider that an emergency, I just don't know what to say. Mr. President, as these articles and others make clear, the United States electric grid is extremely shaky. Thanks in substantial part to a movement to shut down fossil fuel-fired power plants before reliable sources of clean energy are available to replace them, America is running out of power, even as we face huge new power demands. The boom in data center construction in particular to power the rise of artificial intelligence is placing and will place vast new demands upon the grid. A recent CNBC headline noted, and again I quote, "Data centers powering artificial intelligence could use more electricity than entire cities," end quote. More electricity than entire cities. And Mr. President, if we continue on our current course, there is a very real risk that we are we're not going to be able to meet that demand, that we're going to end up with widespread brownouts and blackouts, or electricity rationing, or de facto rationing forced by sky-high energy bills. Now, Mr. President, I realize that this is an inconvenient truth to my Democrat colleagues. Why? Because it interferes with their plans to force the United States off conventional energy. If Democrats acknowledge that we are rapidly approaching an energy crisis, they might have to actually consider the consequences of their energy plans. To consider what might happen when you put immense new power demands on an already shaky grid by forcing Americans into electric vehicles. To consider what might happen if you drastically limit domestic oil and gas production, even as the nation continues to require a steady and affordable supply of conventional fuels. And so I do understand why Democrats would prefer not to acknowledge our national energy emergency. But acknowledge it or not, it's there. And if we don't take action, we're going to be facing some very serious problems in the very near future. So I'm grateful to have a president who recognizes and acknowledges the energy emergency facing our nation. And I look forward to working with him to unleash American energy production and achieve a secure, affordable, and reliable energy future for the American people. Mr. President, I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks.
Mr. President,
I recognize the Democrat leader.
I ask unanimous consent the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
So, Mr. President, over the last month, it's become clear how Donald Trump and Republicans govern. Donald Trump and Republicans have focused on things most Americans don't care about or don't like, while refusing to focus on things Americans actually do care about. Donald Trump and Republicans have focused on things most Americans don't care about or don't even like, while refusing to focus on things Americans actually do care about. Exhibit A of these things that Americans don't like is what's happening today in the House of Representatives. As soon as today, House Republicans will advance a budget resolution clearing the way for perhaps the most draconian cuts to Medicaid in American history. Also, Republicans can cut taxes for their billionaires club and have the American people pick up the tab and pay the price. This is in the category of things Americans really don't like. There's only one proper way to describe the Republican plan that's moving through the House this week: radical. Radical. The Republican plan radically hurts American families while radically helping the billionaires club. Republicans are so eager to cut taxes for billionaires that they'd increase the deficit by $1 trillion or more to make room for their sweetheart deal tax cuts for billionaires like Elon Musk. Republicans are also pushing for trillion in cuts for working and middle-class Americans, endangering everything from Medicaid to nutrition programs to housing assistance and so much more. The Republican bill could cut as much as $880 billion from Medicaid alone. That means 80 million Americans, kids, veterans, people with disabilities, rural Americans, the elderly, are all at risk. And why? Why are Republicans putting these people at such risk and hurting things that benefit them, not waste, things that actually go to people and help them? They're doing it to make life easier for the billionaires club. They're doing it to cut taxes for the ultra-wealthy. Last week, here in the Senate, during Vote-A-Rama, I pushed an amendment that said we should have no tax breaks for billionaires. I pushed an amendment calling for no billionaire tax breaks if even $1 of Medicaid spending was cut. What's more important? Helping people get health care, helping the elderly stay in nursing homes, helping our veterans, especially those who may be out of work, from getting the health care they need. What's more important, that or a tax break for someone who's very wealthy already? Well, on both amendments, the one that said no tax breaks for billionaires and the one that said no tax breaks for billionaires even if $1 of Medicaid spending was cut, both times Republicans overwhelmingly said no. Let us hope, maybe a distant hope, but let us hope that House Republicans show more courage, more compassion, more common sense to reject these horrible, harmful, radical cuts. This is not what the American people signed up for in this election. Billionaire tax cuts is a clear example of things Americans don't like. Just look at all the backlash Republicans are seeing in their town halls. And Republicans know this. Republicans know that cutting taxes for wealthy billionaires is something most Americans don't like at all. They didn't campaign on it. Oh, no. I didn't hear any of our Republican colleagues who were running go home and say, I want to cut taxes for the billionaires, although that's the first thing they're doing when they get here. And yet Republicans seem to be full steam ahead all the same. This, of course, is part of the pattern I'm talking about. Over the last month, Donald Trump and Republicans have spent their energy focused on things Americans don't like, while refusing to focus on things Americans actually do care about, like inflation, rising prices. You already see Americans are upset with the Trump administration because prices continue to rise, as they have over the last many years. Donald Trump promised to bring down costs on day one. He said the first day he's elected, he's going to start bringing costs down, but instead, inflation has gone up, grocery prices are up, chicken, pork, steak, all more expensive, eggs are up 15% from last month. All the while, Republicans are focused on things that Americans either don't like or don't care about. Americans don't like, for instance, pardoning violent insurrectionists. It was one of the least popular things that we have seen. The recent poll in the Washington Post is clear. But that was the first major decision Donald Trump made as president, the first major decision. Most Americans don't care whether you call it the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America or something else. Most Americans don't care about building hotels in Gaza or annexing Canada. Yet these are the things that Donald Trump is focused on to distract people from the fact that he doesn't actually have real solutions to the things Americans really worry about. And of course, there are things that Republicans are focused on that make things actively worse. Most Americans don't think it's a great idea to get into a trade war with our closest allies. That's going to make trips to the grocery store even more expensive than they are now. And of course, most Americans do care about making government more efficient. And while everyone certainly supports cutting waste, Americans don't like the harmful chaos that Elon Musk and Doge have unleashed. They don't want to see a rich billionaire treat federal workers with immense disrespect. And make no mistake, Americans did not sign up for Doge to endanger their Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid benefits. That's not government efficiency. That hurts the American people. And what Doge is doing is chaos. And Americans know that the chaos being unleashed by Doge is causing a lot of harm to the country. Americans don't want to see their air traffic safety personnel fired in droves, no questions asked. That's not government efficiency, that's chaos and danger at the airports and airplanes, at security checkpoints. Our veterans don't want to see the VA starved of resources. Someone came over to me the other day and said, my brother's in a VA hospital. He has a rare disease, and 7 of the people were let go. Who's going to take care of him? They don't want to hear about cuts to the Veterans Crisis Line, where veterans who may have come back from Iraq or Afghanistan with PTSD or other problems have a place to go and a place to call. That's not government efficiency, cutting the Veterans Crisis Line. That's just more chaos, more harm, more hurt. Can you imagine the callousness of firing personnel who operate the Veterans Suicide Crisis Line, as was reported by the staff at the VA? It's a cruel and vindictive way to treat America's heroes. And of course, our 9/11 families did not sign up for Doge trying to cut the 9/11 survivor health program. The people who rushed to the towers, the brave heroes, police, fire, first responders, and others who rushed to the towers the days after that horrible day of 9/11 and got illnesses in their lungs and gastrointestinal tracts, and now we're getting some help. 9/11 families didn't sign up to cut that, but that's precisely what Doge tried to do. We've pushed back, and I'm glad that President Trump and Doge reversed themselves on that issue. They should be reversing themselves on many other issues also that hurt people so badly. But the takeaway is there very clear. What Doge is doing is not making government more efficient. It's creating more chaos. And if there's one thing Americans don't want in these turbulent times, it's more chaos. Rather than actually cut waste in government in a smart way, a careful way, an efficient way, rather than putting the needs of working people first, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, and the Republican Party have plunged basic government services into chaos and taken a meat axe at programs that help workers, middle-class families, and low-income Americans, all for the sake of cutting taxes for billionaires and mega corporations. Republicans are focused on the wrong things, They are helping the wrong people, and they are ignoring the vast majority of Americans they promised to serve. Under Donald Trump's Republican Party, billionaires win, American families lose. So let me say it once again. Over the last month, it's become clear how Donald Trump and Republicans govern. Donald Trump and Republicans have focused on things Americans don't care about or don't like, while refusing to focus on things Americans actually do care about. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsop-Brooks.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I just come to the floor having listened to the minority leader, the Democrat senator from New York, say something to the effect that he thought that President Trump's policies were not popular with the American people. And as he was saying this, I recalled a poll, a Harvard-Harris poll, conducted just this past week. Trump's policies, key thing why he won election as President of the United States, huge popularity of what the President is doing today. Promises that he made prior to the election, promises kept now that he's in the White House. Let's take a look at number one. Deportation of illegal immigrants who've committed crimes. 81% of the American people, and that includes a lot of Democrats, say that is a very popular position taken by President Trump and now being enforced by President Trump. Eliminating fraud and waste in government expenditures. 76% of Americans agree. What have we seen happen with DOGE? What we have seen is actually pointing out fraud and waste in government. The American people are supportive. And then, of course, closing the border. Again, 76% of Americans, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, all across the board, support what President Trump is doing. President Trump ran for office against a party that was the party of high prices and open borders. And it's because of those things that President Trump won, and Republicans won the House and the Senate. So now the minority leader comes to the floor and says that what President Trump's doing aren't popular. Well, they sure are in terms of wasteful Washington spending and closing the border, which were the two reasons that President Trump and Republicans won the elections in November. So let's talk about the things that the American people care about. Republicans, President Trump, all of us promised to get America back on track. That's what we said we would do. That's what we are doing right now. We committed to cutting Washington's wasteful spending. We committed to reducing the size of a bloated government. This is going to make life more affordable for all Americans. President Trump and Republicans are now doing exactly what we promised we would do. We're rooting out waste, we're rooting out fraud, and we're rooting out abuse by a bureaucracy, all across a bureaucracy. And we are ripping it out root and stone. The Department of Government Efficiency has already uncovered more than $55 billion in savings. Who benefits from the savings? The American taxpayers. U.S. taxpayers were spending $2 million. I mean, you take a look at this list. $2 million to develop, quote, sustainable recycling models in the Balkans.
Well, we've canceled that. U.S. taxpayers were spending $19 million on, quote, biodiversity conversations in Nepal. Well, that's been canceled. U.S. taxpayers were spending $47 million to improve, quote, learning outcomes in Asia. Canceled that. U.S. taxpayers were spending $1.5 million on, quote, voter confidence in Liberia, Africa. Well, we've canceled that. U.S. taxpayers were spending $21 million for voter turnout in India. Canceled. More savings are on the way. The Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Lee Zeldin, who we recently confirmed to that post, he uncovered $20 billion with a B, $20 billion in taxpayer money that the Biden EPA shoveled out the door on their last days before leaving office. This was a slush fund, and it was funneled to 8 left-wing climate groups. Now, all of this was in the service of the left's extreme, radical climate agenda, an agenda that makes energy more expensive and life less affordable for American families. So who received these taxpayer-funded, undeserved gifts? Anybody remember Georgia Democrat governor's candidate Stacey Abrams? Well, she was one of them. Her left-wing organization got a $2 billion kickback from the Biden administration. But I'm so glad that Ambassador Zeldin caught this scam and is working to claw back the money for the taxpayers of this nation. Now, I heard the minority leader admit just this morning, he said, of course there's some wasteful spending. He didn't mention any of those things. He doesn't actually point out to what it is. But I don't hear him say what wasteful spending he wants to cut. In fact, I haven't heard any Democrats say what wasteful spending any should be cut. What about that $2 billion that's been sent to Stacey Abrams? Democrats added almost $5 trillion to our debt in 4 years. Joe Biden and Democrats' reckless spending caused painfully high prices. Look, cutting wasteful Washington spending has been long overdue. President Trump and Republicans are uncovering massive evidence of wasteful Washington spending, and we're stopping it. Democrats seem more upset that the waste they support is now being exposed than the massive waste itself. Instead of defending the indefensible and the obscene level of spending, what are they doing? What are the Democrats doing? They are demanding that the courts intervene. Hey, let's get the courts involved. This is the next chapter of destructive Democrat behavior. Democrats have now filed over 80 lawsuits in 1 month against the Trump administration. Now, often they go judge shopping. What are they looking for? They're looking for partisan activist judges. So how does that work? Well, last month, it's unbelievable. Last month, the state of New Jersey wanted to sue the administration. So they filed suit, not in New Jersey, but in Massachusetts. They sued in a district where 11 of the 13 district judges were appointed by Democrat presidents. They didn't think they could accomplish what they wanted to accomplish in their own home state, so they go to Massachusetts, one of the most liberal states in the country. That is not a coincidence. It's intentional. It's premeditated. What's the aim of it? It's to obstruct President Trump's popular cost-cutting efforts. Let me tell you how far the Democrats are taking this. Earlier this month, a federal judge in New York issued a knee-jerk order that forbids political appointees from accessing records within the Treasury Department. The judge actually went so far as to block the Secretary of the Treasury, Scott Bessent, from accessing important data within the agency that he runs, that he has been confirmed to serve as the Secretary of Treasury by this very body, by the United States Senate. And you get a judge saying he doesn't have access to the Treasury records. So a federal judge blocks a Senate-confirmed Secretary of Treasury from getting the information he needs to do to run the U.S. Department of the Treasury. That's where the Democrats are headed. District courts should not get to micromanage the executive branch. Yet that's what Democrats want to do with the courts, and that's why they filed 80 lawsuits so far. It's not based on the law. It's not based on policy disagreements. This is based solely on political disagreements. This is the real crisis we're facing in America. It's what I hear about in Wyoming, heard about it this past weekend. It's the unelected, unaccountable, heavy-handed federal bureaucrats who have taken America off track. We're getting America back on track. The American people are being strangled by Washington's wasteful spending, by burdensome red tape. According to a poll last month from the Associated Press, almost 2 in 3 Americans say government inefficiency is a major problem. The bureaucracy must be accountable to the American people, and they are there to serve the American people. Americans voted in November for more accountability. They voted to drain the swamp. This is the swamp I'm talking about, and that's exactly what President Trump is doing. Working with President Trump, Senate Republicans are going to deliver on our mandate, and it's going to involve massive change in Washington, because it's time, Mr. President, to get America back on track. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
I recognize the senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, did you see over the weekend Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, dancing on a stage with a chainsaw? Did you see that? Most Americans did. That was his approach to DOGE, government efficiency. Take a chainsaw to it. Put an agency like USAID in the wood chipper, in his words. Does this sound like a thoughtful approach to making government more efficient? Or does it sound like a meat axe approach to a man who has no business being there? Unelected individual who somehow has been given authority by this president to lop off tens of thousands of jobs day in and day out. Yes, we've gone to court. Many of the agencies of the government, the employees and their representatives have gone to court to question this ham-handed approach to making this government work. And they've been successful in the overwhelming percentage to receive temporary restraining orders and the like, because on its face, serious questions are raised as to the authority of this president. We've got time-honored traditions when it comes to things like impoundment of federal funds. The president cannot make that decision unilaterally. The power of the purse happens to be with the Article I agency of our government, the legislature, not with the Article II agency, the executive. And as a consequence, when the president decides to do this unilaterally, he is being challenged in court, and he should be challenged in court. This is not just a political issue, as one senator just described. It is, more importantly, a constitutional issue and a legal issue. And it's going to be resolved ultimately by the court. Perhaps the president will win some of his cases and lose others. But this is a legitimate exercise of the authority under the Constitution. And I might add that this notion that we're going to start lopping off air traffic controllers and people responsible for aviation safety, I would just say to those who are for that and believe that's draining the swamp, pay attention to what's happening across America. These terrible aviation disasters, like the one that happened here in Washington, D.C., should be taken seriously by us every day. And putting people in charge of these departments who don't have adequate staff to monitor the flights in our nation is an act of irresponsibility as far as I'm concerned. The same thing's true with avian flu. Yes, the price of eggs is terrible. And one of the reasons is avian flu is killing off the flocks of laying hens, and as a consequence, we have fewer eggs and higher prices. There's a very real concern that this avian flu is going to jump from these birds and fowl into the human chain, and we'll face another pandemic. Do we want that? For God's sake, no. But the notion that we're going to lop off employees that are responsible for public health one after the other and somehow make this a safer nation is irresponsible on its face. Should it be challenged in court? Of course it should be. And I stand by that. I just want to say to the senator and others who make these comments, think about what you're inviting here, to give the president the authority this Congress has, authority under the Constitution, to just give it away. Are we going to give away our responsibility under the Constitution? Because of the popularity of this president with some members, I pray that we won't. On a totally different subject, Mr. President, I'd like to tell you about one of my constituents. He's a man from New Lenox, Illinois. It's in the suburbs of Chicago. Late last year, he received an urgent phone call from someone claiming to be a deputy in the Will County Sheriff's Office. This self-proclaimed deputy informed my constituents that he had missed jury duty. As a result, the deputy said, "There's a warrant out for your arrest." The man was stunned. "Don't worry," the deputy further explained. The man could avoid arrest and put the whole matter behind him. All he had to do was pay the fine. But he couldn't pay by check or credit card. The deputy directed the man to a local cryptocurrency ATM machine and told him to deposit $15,000 into the machine, pay the fine, and all would be forgiven. If you've been following the news, you might have guessed by now the man on the phone wasn't a sheriff's deputy at all. He was a scammer. And once my constituent deposited his money into the crypto ATM, it was gone. Gone. There was no way to trace the transaction to the scammer and no way to get the money back. This is just one example of growing and alarming trend of crypto ATM fraud. There are now more than 30,000 cryptocurrency ATMs in this country, and they are being used by criminals to cheat Americans out of their hard-earned savings to the tune of $114 million in 2023 alone. Most of the victims are senior citizens. While these scams aren't all identical, they generally play out just like the one I described. A stranger calls and pretends to be from the government or the victim's bank. They make claims of unpaid fines, a frozen bank account, a credit card in default, or even threaten arrest. The scammer then tells their victim that they must immediately go to a crypto ATM at a nearby grocery store, gas station, or convenience store. Often the scammer will try to stay on the phone with the victim throughout the scam, warning of dire consequences if they don't make their payments immediately. It's a way of preventing their victim from getting a moment to take a breath and just maybe realize what's going on. Once the victim arrives at the crypto ATM, the scammer will walk them through the process of depositing real money, cash, into the machine, buying a Bitcoin or another cryptocurrency, and sending it to the scammer's digital wallet. Last summer, a small business owner in my hometown of Springfield, Illinois, removed a crypto ATM from his store after witnessing senior after senior walk in, talking on their phones, looking stressed, and depositing huge sums of cash into the machines. He said, quote, 100% of the time that we saw somebody at the machine, they were being scammed. This was in a small store in Springfield, Illinois. It wasn't just happening there. There are tragic stories of seniors losing their savings through these machines in every state in America. South Carolina, retired couple lost $390,000 over the course of several months to a scam involving crypto ATMs. Just this month, the sheriff's office in Walton County, Florida, reported a resident was cheated out of $129,000 through a crypto ATM. Mr. President, it's past time that we put some common sense guardrails in place to stop fraud in this largely unregulated industry. That's why today I'm joining with Senators Blumenthal, Reed, and Welch to introduce the Crypto ATM Fraud Prevention Act. This bill will require crypto ATM operators to warn consumers about scams and take reasonable steps to prevent fraud at their machines. It will also put in place measures to limit the amount that consumers lose when they do fall victim to scams, and will give law enforcement new tools to track down and fight back against criminals. I want to share a few of the key measures of this bill with you. First, the bill will provide special protection for consumers during the 2 weeks after they make their first transaction at a crypto ATM, the period when a consumer is most likely to be a victim of fraud. During this time, customers will be limited to deposits of $2,000 per day and $10,000 total. While this is still a lot of money, it ensures people's entire life savings are not put at risk. The bill will also require crypto ATM operators to obtain verbal confirmation via a live phone call for any transaction with a new customer over $500. Do you remember when I told you scammers often stay on the phone with victims until the money's been deposited in their digital wallet? Well, this requirement will break that communication, give victims a chance to think, perhaps reach out to another member of the family. and make sure crypto ATM operators can assess whether the customer is being scammed. Next, the bill requires crypto ATM operators to give prominent, clear warnings about the risk of fraud and to tell consumers about common types of scams. While warnings alone are not enough, they're part of the key to preventing fraud. Operators also will be required to issue paper receipts to customers after each transaction. The receipt will include, among other things, the date, time, and amount of transactions and the transaction hash, which will allow law enforcement to more easily trace the transaction, collect evidence of the crime, and maybe even recover the stolen funds. Next, operators will be required to use the analytics to screen for suspicious, illicit transactions. Some companies are effectively using this technology already. It should be used across the board. Finally, crypto ATM operators will be required to issue refunds to consumers who are victims of fraud. As long as victims make a sworn report to law enforcement and notify the operator within 30 days of the transaction, they will be entitled to a refund. New customers will get full refunds. All other customers will be entitled to refund of, at minimum, any fees associated with the transaction. Mr. President, these measures are common sense guardrails that will prevent countless Americans, particularly senior citizens, from losing thousands of dollars of their hard-earned savings to criminal scams. I urge all my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to join me to pass this bill into law. We don't have any time to waste. Mr. President, I yield the floor. I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsobrooks.
Mr. President,
Senator from Oklahoma.
I ask for unanimous, consent to call off the quorum.
Without objection.
Thank you.
The question is on the nomination.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Also Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto, Mr. Cotton, Mr. Kramer, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Curtis, Mr. Daines, Ms. Duckworth, Mr. Durbin, Ms. Ernst, Mr. Fetterman, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Gallego, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Resch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young. Senators voting in the affirmative. Senators voting in the affirmative: Bennett, Britt, Cotton, Fisher, Grassley, Hassan, Heinrich, Hickenlooper, Johnson, Kane, Klobuchar, Marshall, Moody, Mullen, Peters, Ricketts, Scott of Florida, Scott of South Carolina, Sheehy. Senators voting in the negative: Coons, Merkley, Murray, Ossoff, Schatz, Whitehouse. Ms. Cortez Masto, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, no. Mr. Risch, aye. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Justice, aye. Mr. Warnock, no. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Ms. Warren, no. Mrs. Hyde Smith. Mrs. Hyde Smith, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Curtis, aye. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Mrs. Capito. Mrs. Capito, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Paul. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Gallego, aye. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Markey, no. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks. Aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins. Aye. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd. Aye. Mr. Schiff. Mr. Schiff. No. Ms. Rosen. Ms. Rosen. Aye. Mr. McCormick. Mr. McCormick. Aye. Mr. Cassidy. Mr. Cassidy. Aye. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy. Aye. Mr. Kim. Mr. Kim. No. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt. Aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester. Ms. Blunt Rochester. No. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Sullivan. Aye. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds. Aye. Ms. Slotkin. Ms. Slotkin. No. And Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Tillis, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Miss Ernst, aye. Mr. Fetterman, aye. Mr. Haggerty, aye. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Padilla, no. Mr. Murphy, no. Mr. King, no. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Booker, no. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Miss Lummis, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Moreno. Mr. Moreno, aye. Mr. Daines. Mr. Daines, aye.
We're good? Okay. So just read off this one then. All right. On this vote, the yeas are 66, the nays are 28. The nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, the motion to reconsider is considered made and laid upon the table, and the President will be immediately notified of the Senate's actions.
Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that Senator Kennedy be recognized for up to 15 minutes, and upon the use or yielding back of time, then make a motion to proceed to calendar number 15, S.J. Res. number 11.
Without objection. Senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, I rise today for two reasons. Number one, I'm losing one of my best colleagues. She's sitting right here next to me, Miss Jess Andrews. Jess has run my communication shop for, I don't know how many years, 5 years. You know, I try to hire really good people, and certainly Jess is one of them. She's a very moral person. She's whip smart. But when you hire good people, you know you're going to lose them, because good people, capable people like Jess are ambitious people, and they want to move on to new positions. Jess is becoming Deputy Chief of Staff to our new Senator from Ohio, and I wish her well, and I just wanted to thank her publicly. Jess Andrews is the real deal. And she has just done an extraordinary job for the people of Louisiana and for the American people, and I am so, so grateful. I congratulate our new Senator from Ohio. He's getting a good one. So thank you, Jess. Mr. President, the second reason I rise is to talk about a regulation that I'm trying to get rid of. But I want to begin with this observation. Nearly 5 years ago, when he was running for president, I remember it like it was yesterday, President Biden said, quote, "I guarantee you we're going to end fossil fuels," end quote. I guarantee you, he said, in front of God, country, and the American people, I guarantee you, he said, we're going to end fossil fuels. And he tried. For 4 years, he tried. Here's why I point that out. The first well drilled in the Gulf of America, I know some people call it the Gulf of Mexico. I don't want to get off into that discussion. But the first well drilled offshore in the Gulf of America was drilled in 87 years ago in 1938. Since then, we have drilled, I think, 6,000 wells. There are 6,000 platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, before an oil company drills a well, on its own volition and at the suggestion of the Department of Interior, the oil company surveys the seabed. Just makes sense for safety reasons, but also for the sake of history, because we want to look for shipwrecks. We have found, I don't know how many shipwrecks, Mr. President. I had it written down, and 4,000 shipwrecks. We've surveyed the entire Gulf of America in the 87 years since we started drilling there. We have surveyed 311,652 square nautical miles, the surface area of Texas and California put together. That's how we found 4,000 shipwrecks. And it's cost hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars. So we know what's there. We know what's there. Well, in September of 2024, the Department of Interior, in a midnight regulation, in an effort to try to further hurt fossil fuels, passed a new rule. And they said, look, we know we've surveyed the entire Gulf, and we know we found 4,000 shipwrecks. And we know that the area that we surveyed is the size of California and Texas put together. But every time you drill a new well, we want you to survey again. Well, why? I mean, what's the benefit? We know what the cost is. It costs anywhere from $10,000 to $1 million to resurvey again. It just makes no sense. And a third of the production in the Gulf is from independent oil companies. Maybe the majors can support this, but if an independent oil company has to survey what's already been surveyed, it can add, as I said, $10,000 to $1 million to well cost. What's the point? I can tell you what the point is. Somebody over at BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Department of Interior, hates fossil fuels. Somebody or somebodies. Now, I'm not saying that the person who came up with this rule is the dumbest guy in the world. But that person better hope that the dumbest guy in the world doesn't die. Because this is just bone deep down to the marrow dumb. This is the kind of spending porn that we all ought to abhor. So I'm going to try to kill the regulation today under what, as you know, Mr. President, is called the Congressional Review Act. We'll be voting on that. We'll be voting on that shortly. And I hope that I realize that common sense, as I've said before, is illegal in Washington. This is not a normal place. But I hope folks who still have common sense will vote to get rid of this, this foolish rule. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Mr. President.
Senator from Louisiana.
I move to proceed to Cal number 15, SJ Res 11.
Clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 15, SJ Res 11, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 United States Code of the rule submitted by the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management relating to protection of marine archaeological resources.
I ask, Mr. President, for the yeas and the nays.
Is there an official second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Alsop-Brooks, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Banks, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Bennett, Mrs. Blackburn, Mr. Blumenthal, Ms. Blunt-Rochester, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Britt, Mr. Budd, Ms. Cantwell, Mrs. Capito, Mr. Cassidy, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Cornyn, Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Curtis. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Ms. Ernst. Mr. Fetterman. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gallego. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Haggerty, Ms. Hassan, Mr. Hawley, Mr. Heinrich, Mr. Hickenlooper, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Husted, Mrs. Hyde-Smith, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Justice, Mr. Kane, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Kennedy, Mr. Kim, Mr. King, Ms. Klobuchar, Mr. Langford, Mr. Lee, Mr. Lujan, Ms. Lummis, Mr. Markey, Mr. Marshall, Mr. McConnell, Mr. McCormick, Mr. Merkley, Mrs. Moody, Mr. Moran, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Mullen, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Ossoff, Mr. Padilla, Mr. Paul, Mr. Peters, Mr. Reed, Mr. Ricketts, Mr. Risch, Ms. Rosen, Mr. Rounds, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schiff, Mr. Schmidt, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott of Florida, Mr. Scott of South Carolina, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Sheehy, Ms. Slotkin, Ms. Smith, Mr. Sullivan, Mr. Thune, Mr. Tillis, Mr. Tuberville, Mr. Van Hollen, Mr. Warner, Mr. Warnock, Ms. Warren, Mr. Welch, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Mr. Young, Senators voting in the affirmative: Cassidy, Cortez Masto, Crapo, Curtis, Daines, Haggerty, Hoeven, Justice, Kennedy, McConnell, McCormick, Schatz, Tillis, Welch, and Wicker. Senators voting in the negative: Booker, Fetterman, Gillibrand, Heinrich, Kane, King, Merkley, and Ossoff. Mr. Kim, no. Ms. Warren, no. Mr. Reed, no. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Scott of Florida, aye. Mr. Cruz, aye. Ms. Lummis, Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn. Aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher. Aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Mullen. Mr. Mullen, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mrs. Hyde-Smith, aye. Mr. Husted. Mr. Husted, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Smith. Ms. Smith, no. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, no. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Padilla. Mr. Padilla, no. Mrs. Blackburn. Mrs. Blackburn, aye. Ms. Ernst. Ms. Ernst, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, no. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott of South Carolina, aye. Mr. Banks. Mr. Banks, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, no. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Schatz, no. Mr. Welch, no. Mr. Paul, aye. Mr. Ricketts, aye. Mr. Langford, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, no. Mr. Cotton, aye. Ms. Blunt Rochester, no. Mr. Marshall, aye. Mr. Schumer, no. Mr. Schiff, no. Mrs. Moody. Mrs. Moody, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, no. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rounds, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mrs. Britt. Mrs. Britt, aye. Ms. Hassan. Ms. Hassan, no. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen, no. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, no. Mr. Peters. Mr. Peters, no. Mr. Durbin, no. Mrs. Capito, aye. Mr. Young, aye. They don't make them anymore? Mr. Lujan, no. Mr. Warnock, no.
They made.
Mr. Moreno, aye.
They were made in France.
Which were? Mr. Murphy, no. Ms. Klobuchar, no. Mr. Markey, no. Ms. Slotkin, no. Mr. Sheehy, aye. Mr. Schmidt. Mr. Schmidt, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Ms. Duckworth. Ms. Duckworth, no. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, no. Mr. Budd. Mr. Budd, aye. Mr. Warner. Mr. Warner, no. Mr. Gallego. Mr. Gallego, no. Mr. Hickenlooper. Mr. Hickenlooper, aye. Ms. Rosen, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Coons, no. Mr. Hawley, aye. Mr. Sullivan, aye. Ms. Baldwin, no.
On this vote, the ayes are 54, the nays are 42. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will report.
Counter number 15, S.J. Res. 11, providing for congressional disapproval under Chapter 8 of Title 5 and so forth.
Under the provisions of 5 U.S.C. 802, there will now be up to 10 hours of debate equally divided. Under the provisions ordered, the Senate stands in recess until 2:15 p.m.